Atlanta has been destroyed more times than any major city in America. And the remarkable thing is that most of those times, Atlanta did it to itself. There's a small brass marker embedded in the ground near the old railroad viaducts in downtown Atlanta. It marks what's called the 0 milepost, the exact spot where, in 1837, a surveyor drove a stake into the red Georgia clay and said, in effect, "Here," not because there was a river, not because there was a harbor or a natural spring or a seam of coal or a mountain pass, just because the mathematics of the Western and Atlantic Railroad said this was where the line should end. The settlement that gathered around that stake didn't even get a proper name at first. People just called it Terminus, the end of the line. That is Atlanta's origin story. Not a place that was discovered or founded or fought over, but a place that was calculated. A spot on a map that existed for no reason except that someone decided it should. And that restlessness, that magnificent, maddening refusal to sit still is both the reason Atlanta became one of the great cities of the American South and the reason it is, right now, quietly falling apart at the seams. The 0 milepost still exists. You can find it under an overpass near 5 Points, the old commercial heart of downtown. Most people walk right past it. The irony of that will become clear. When the Western and Atlantic Railroad was chartered by the state of Georgia in the 1830s, the plan was simple. Build a rail line from Chattanooga, Tennessee, down through the mountains to a terminus point somewhere in the Georgia interior, connecting the Midwest's river trade to the ports of the Southeast. The site chosen for that terminus had essentially nothing to recommend it other than geography. It sat on a low ridge of the Piedmont Plateau at a point roughly equidistant from several other rail lines being built through Georgia. There was no town, no trading post, barely any settlement at all. The land was mostly forest and red clay. By 1843, a few dozen families had gathered there, enough that they needed something better to call the place than Terminus. So they renamed it Marthasville, after the daughter of the sitting governor. But that didn't stick either. By 1847, the settlement had grown to perhaps 1,000 people, had incorporated as a city, and adopted the name Atlanta, a feminized shortening of Atlantic from the railroad that had created it. Think about that for a moment. A city of 1,000 people, sitting on land with no particular reason to exist, incorporated itself under a name derived from a railroad that hadn't even finished being built. Atlanta was betting on a future that didn't exist yet. It would never stop doing that. The railroads came, and they came fast. By the late 1850s, 4 major rail lines converged at Atlanta, making it the most important rail junction in the Deep South. Cotton, timber, and manufactured goods flowed through. Warehouses and commission houses clustered near the tracks. Hotels went up to serve the drummers and merchants who changed trains in town. The population climbed past 9,000. Machine shops opened to service the locomotives. The city that had been nothing 20 years earlier was suddenly something that mattered, which is precisely why, on the night of November 15, 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman ordered it burned. The destruction of Atlanta during Sherman's march to the sea is one of the most famous episodes in American military history, so well known that it almost obscures the more interesting story underneath. Sherman's men burned the railroad infrastructure first, the depots, the roundhouses, the machine shops, because the railroads were what made Atlanta strategically important. Then the fires spread. By the time the Union Army marched out the next morning, roughly 40% of the city had been destroyed. The business district was gutted. The old Atlanta Hotel, which had stood near the 0 milepost, was ash. Churches, homes, stores, gone. What remained was a city of chimneys standing in fields of rubble, surrounded by a population that had largely fled. Here is where Atlanta's real story begins. Not with the burning, but with what came after. Because the thing that makes Atlanta different from every other southern city that suffered in the Civil War is the speed and the philosophy with which it rebuilt. Atlanta did not mourn what had been lost. Atlanta did not try to restore what Sherman had destroyed. Atlanta looked at the ashes and saw a building site. Within 5 years of the war's end, the population had recovered and the railroads were running again. Within 6 years, a northern-born entrepreneur named Hannibal Kimball had built the most extravagant hotel in the entire South on a lot near the old depot. The Kimball House, as it was called, cost roughly $650,000, an almost incomprehensible sum for a city that had been rubble half a decade earlier. One historian calculated that the hotel's construction cost represented about 1/15 of the total assessed value of all real estate in Atlanta at the time. Kimball, a carpetbagger in the truest sense, had financed the thing through a tangled web of bonds, mortgages, and subscriptions so complex that he ended up filing for bankruptcy and losing control of the building within a year. But the hotel itself was magnificent. 6 stories, 350 rooms, the first building in Atlanta to have elevators and central heating. It stood on an entire city block near 5 Points, just steps from the 0 milepost, and for decades it served as the social and political center of the city. State legislators stayed there when the General Assembly was in session. Business deals that shaped the entire region were struck in its lobby. The Kimball House was Atlanta's declaration of intent. We are not a city that preserves things. We are a city that builds things. Remember that. Nobody embodied this philosophy more than Henry Grady, the young editor of the Atlanta Constitution, who in the 1880s became the most famous spokesman for what he called the New South. Grady's argument was simple and revolutionary. The old South of plantations and agrarian aristocracy was dead, killed by the war and good riddance. The New South would be industrial, commercial, forward-looking, integrated into the national economy. It would build factories and railroads and hotels. It would court northern capital. It would not look backward. In December of 1886, Grady traveled to New York and delivered a speech to a banquet of northern industrialists and politicians that became one of the most quoted orations of the 19th century. The Old South, he told them, was gone. The New South was living, breathing, growing every hour. He was 36 years old. The audience gave him a standing ovation. 3 years later, he was dead of pneumonia, but the idea he had sold, Atlanta as the capital of a South that had made its peace with modernity, became the city's operating philosophy for the next century and beyond. Atlanta hosted the International Cotton Exposition in 1881 and the Cotton States and International Exposition in 1895. It built new rail terminals and commercial blocks along Peachtree Street, the main north-south artery that had been a trail before it was a road, before it was the most famous street name in the South. Money poured in. The city's population, barely 20,000 in 1870, hit 90,000 by 1900. But here is something that most accounts of Atlanta's Gilded Age leave out. Running parallel to Peachtree Street's white commercial district, just a few blocks to the east, a separate city was being built. Auburn Avenue, known to everyone who lived there as Sweet Auburn, became, by the early 20th century, arguably the most prosperous black commercial street in the United States. The anchor of Sweet Auburn was a man named Alonzo Herndon. Born into slavery in 1858 in Social Circle, Georgia, Herndon walked off his family's farm after emancipation, taught himself barbering, and by the 1890s owned a chain of barbershops in Atlanta that catered to the city's white elite. His flagship shop on Peachtree Street had crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and 25 chairs. He took the money from those barbershops and, in 1905, founded the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, which would grow into one of the largest black-owned businesses in America. By the time of his death in 1927, Herndon was widely regarded as Atlanta's first black millionaire. Herndon was not alone. Auburn Avenue, by the 1920s and 1930s, was home to banks, insurance companies, newspapers, nightclubs, churches, and fraternal lodges, all black-owned, all thriving within the confines of a rigidly segregated city. The Royal Peacock nightclub drew performers from across the country. The Atlanta Daily World, founded in 1928, became one of the nation's first black daily newspapers. The block between Butler and Bell Streets was dense with commerce in a way that even Peachtree Street might have envied. John Wesley Dobbs, a civic leader and Grand Master of the Prince Hall Masons, gave Auburn Avenue its nickname, Sweet Auburn, and it stuck because it was true. In 1956, a writer for Fortune magazine called it the richest Negro street in the world. On January 15, 1929, A boy named Michael King, Jr. was born in a modest Queen Anne house at 501 Auburn Avenue, the son of a Baptist preacher. He would later change his name to Martin Luther King, Jr. That house still stands, but almost nothing else on that stretch of Auburn Avenue does, at least not the way it was. The reason why is a story about concrete and politics and a particular kind of civic blindness that Atlanta perfected, but that comes later. For now, it's worth staying in the first half of the 20th century a little longer, because this is when Atlanta built the things it would later spend decades tearing down. In 1905, Terminal Station opened on Spring Street in downtown Atlanta, designed by the architect P. Thornton Mary, whose firm would also design the Fox Theater and the Capital City Club. Terminal Station was a soaring Beaux-Arts structure with a grand concourse that served 4 major railroads. On its opening day, a military band played Down in Dixie, and the platforms were thronged with people who had come simply to see the building. It was Atlanta's front door, the place where visitors arrived, and it was built to impress. A third Union Station, the smaller of the 2 downtown terminals, opened in 1930 on Forsyth Street, a few blocks west. Meanwhile, Peachtree Street kept growing. The Equitable Building, Atlanta's first skyscraper, had gone up in 1892. The Candler Building followed in 1906, built by Asa Griggs Candler, the pharmaceutical magnate who had purchased a peculiar soft drink formula from a struggling pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton. The story of that purchase is pure Atlanta. Pemberton had concocted his syrup, originally marketed as a patent medicine, in 1886 and sold it from a soda fountain at Jacob's Pharmacy on Peachtree Street. It did modestly well, but Pemberton was sick and in debt, and over the next 2 years he sold off rights to the formula in pieces to various buyers. Candler, a methodical businessman with an instinct for branding, acquired enough of those pieces to claim ownership of the whole thing. By the early 1900s, Coca-Cola was a national product, and its headquarters on Peachtree Street was pumping money into Atlanta at a rate that dwarfed nearly everything else. A pharmacist's tonic sold from a single soda fountain had become the most recognizable brand in the world, and the city that housed it reaped the benefits in jobs, tax revenue, and an outsized influence on civic life. When Robert Woodruff took over Coca-Cola in 1923, at the age of 33, inheriting the presidency from his father, he didn't just run the company, he ran Atlanta. For the next 6 decades until his death in 1985, Woodruff's influence shaped everything from the city's cultural institutions to its politics to its racial negotiations. He was not a public man. He worked through back channels, phone calls, quiet meetings. He poured Coca-Cola money into Emory University, into the arts, into hospitals. He brokered deals between the white business establishment and the city's black leadership. When Atlanta's civic leaders wanted something done, they went to Woodruff's office on North Avenue. When Woodruff wanted something done, it got done. The joke among Atlanta insiders was that the city had 2 governments, one at City Hall and one at Coca-Cola, and you couldn't always tell which one was in charge. And then there was the theater. In 1893, a Belgian-born entrepreneur named Laurent de Gives had built the Grand Opera House on the corner of Peachtree and Forsyth Streets. It was the 3rd largest theater of its kind in the United States when it opened, and the Atlanta Constitution declared that the occasion suggested Paris. The Loews organization purchased it in 1927 and renovated it into a movie palace. And on the evening of December 15, 1939, it became the site of the most extravagant film premiere in American history. Gone with the Wind premiered at the Loews Grand Theater on a night when Atlanta essentially shut down to celebrate itself. Clark Gable, Vivian Leigh, and most of the film's stars were in attendance. The governor declared a state holiday. 300,000 people lined Peachtree Street to watch the motorcade. It was, in many ways, Atlanta's apotheosis. A city that had been burned to the ground 75 years earlier was now starring in the most expensive movie ever made, a movie about its own destruction and rebirth. The Phoenix myth made real, projected on a screen inside a theater on the street where it had all happened. Remember the Loews Grand, remember Terminal Station, remember the Kimball House and Sweet Auburn, because what Atlanta did to these places over the next 40 years is the central act of this story. It started with the automobile. In the late 1940s, Georgia's highway planners began charting routes for the new interstate system through metropolitan Atlanta. 3 major highways would converge downtown: Interstate 75 from the northwest, Interstate 85 from the northeast, and Interstate 20 from the east and west. Where I-75 and I-85 merged, they would form a combined corridor called the Downtown Connector, a highway driven like a spike through the center of the city. The routes, as a Georgia Department of Transportation report from that era noted, were intended to go through marginal neighborhoods. In practice, marginal meant black. The original plan for the Downtown Connector would have driven the highway directly through the headquarters of the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, Alonzo Herndon's company, the financial heart of Black Atlanta. When John Wesley Dobbs and other community leaders protested, the route was shifted several blocks east. It still sliced through Auburn Avenue. The interstate created a 10-lane viaduct through the middle of Sweet Auburn, casting a permanent shadow over what had been the community's commercial core. Businesses that had thrived for decades found themselves stranded on the wrong side of a concrete wall. Customers couldn't cross. Foot traffic vanished. One resident named Mabel Hawk later called the connector the death blow that ended Sweet Auburn's golden age. She was not exaggerating. The highway didn't just damage Auburn Avenue, it severed it. The thriving corridor that fortune had called the richest Negro street in the world became a neighborhood bisected by roaring traffic, its commercial blocks hollowed out, its residents displaced into a city that was simultaneously growing more segregated through redlining, zoning, and the steady drumbeat of white flight to the suburbs. And the damage wasn't finished. In the 1980s, the Georgia Department of Transportation expanded the Downtown Connector from 6 through lanes to 12, then ultimately to 14, just prior to the 1996 Olympics, in a project optimistically called Freeing the Freeways. Each widening nibbled further into the remains of the neighborhoods that the original construction had already gutted. Mechanicsville, the old neighborhood of railroad workers south of downtown, was virtually obliterated by the interchange where the connector met Interstate 20. What the highway didn't take, the construction of Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, built to lure Major League sports, finished off a few years later. Block by block, the neighborhoods that had given Atlanta its texture and its human scale were being fed to concrete, and the highways were only the beginning. Starting in the late 1950s, Atlanta embarked on a demolition campaign that, building by building, erased much of the physical city that had taken a century to build. The National Park Service would later describe it bluntly: the Kimball House Hotel, whose demolition in 1959 signaled the beginning of a wave of demolitions that destroyed many of the city's most famous landmarks in the 1960s and 1970s. The Kimball House, the hotel that Hannibal Kimball had built for $650,000 on the ashes of the Civil War, the hotel that had been the social and political center of Atlanta for nearly a century, the building that had burned in 1883 and been rebuilt even grander on the same spot, was torn down to make room for a parking garage. A parking garage. On the site where Atlanta had declared itself a city, where deals had been made that shaped the entire South, where governors and senators had dined and slept and argued, there would now be a concrete structure where people left their Buicks while they went to lunch. Then the railroad stations, Terminal Station, Thornton Mary's Grand Beaux Arts masterpiece, the building where the military band had played on opening day in 1905, closed in 1970. It was demolished in 1972. The Richard B. Russell Federal Building, a brutalist government office, was built on its site. Union Station, the third iteration of the depot that had stood near the zero milepost since the 1850s, was demolished the same year. Today, a parking lot occupies the land where it stood. In 1977, the Loews Grand Theater, the theater where Gone with the Wind had premiered, where Vivian Leigh had sat in a gold lame gown while 300,000 Atlantans lined the streets, closed its doors due to declining attendance. It had been placed on the National Register of Historic Places that same year, and a growing movement was organizing to save it. On the morning of January 30th, 1978, the abandoned theater caught fire. Some suspected arson. The building occupied prime real estate, and the fire started, as one preservationist pointedly noted, just as the heat was on to save it. No conclusive evidence was ever found. The Loews Grand was demolished later that year. In the space of 2 decades, Atlanta had demolished its greatest hotel, both of its downtown railroad stations, and the theater where it had staged its most famous night. It had driven a 14-lane highway through its most prosperous black neighborhood, and it had done all of this not in decline, but in a period of aggressive growth, driven by the same philosophy that Henry Grady had preached almost a century earlier. Don't look back. Build the new thing. The old thing is already gone. This is the part of the story where it's important to understand what the city too busy to hate actually meant. That phrase, coined in the late 1950s by Mayor William Hartsfield, who had governed Atlanta for most of the previous 2 decades, was Atlanta's brand during the Civil Rights era. While Birmingham had Bull Connor and fire hoses, Atlanta would negotiate. While Little Rock had the National Guard blocking schoolhouse doors, Atlanta would desegregate quietly through backroom deals between the white business establishment and black leaders. The city's commercial class understood that racial violence was bad for business. Robert Woodruff, the Coca-Cola patriarch, made this calculus explicitly. A city known for racial strife would not attract the northern investment that Atlanta needed, so Atlanta dealt. In 1961, it desegregated its public schools without the kind of violent spectacle that had rocked other southern cities. In 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize and, after some initial resistance, the city's white business leaders hosted a biracial dinner in his honor, largely at Woodruff's insistence. In 1973, Maynard Jackson became the first black mayor of a major southern city, and he used the leverage of the new airport construction to mandate minority participation in city contracts at levels that were unprecedented. But too busy to hate had a shadow meaning. Too busy also meant too busy to stop and look at what was being lost. Too busy to fight for a grand old hotel when a parking garage was more profitable. Too busy to reroute a highway when the neighborhood in its path didn't have the political power to stop it. The deals that made Atlanta the most racially progressive city in the South were real achievements. But they were deals, transactions with winners and losers and costs that got quietly absorbed by the people who had the least power to object. One of those transactions involved transit. In 1971, when the newly formed Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, MARTA, asked voters in 5 metro counties to approve funding for a rail and bus system, the suburban counties refused. Gwinnett County voters said no. Cobb County said no. Clayton County said no. Only Fulton and DeKalb counties, which included the city itself, approved the tax. The reasons were partly financial and partly something else entirely. A Princeton historian who has studied the period put it simply. White suburbanites moved to the suburbs to get away from Atlanta, and by Atlanta they generally meant black people. They did not want a physical rail connection between their communities and the city. The derisive nickname, moving Africans rapidly through Atlanta, was said openly enough that it entered the historical record. The result was a transit system that served only a fraction of the metro area, while highways served everything else. To this day, MARTA remains the largest mass transit system in the United States that receives no state funding, not a dollar from the Georgia state government. Revenue from the state's motor fuel tax is restricted by law to roads and bridges. It cannot be spent on public transportation. The system that was supposed to connect the city instead became a symbol of its divisions. Atlanta became, in the words of one urban scholar, America's poster child for dysfunctional, racially inequitable, environmentally unsustainable urban mobility. The highways that had gutted the city's neighborhoods were now the only way to get around a region that was sprawling outward at a speed that astonished even its own planners. And sprawl it did. Atlanta's Hartsfield International Airport, later renamed Hartsfield-Jackson after Maynard Jackson, became the busiest airport in the world, a distinction it has held for most of the past 3 decades. Ted Turner headquartered CNN in Atlanta in 1980, anchoring a media district downtown and adding another Fortune 500 company to the cluster. The 1996 Summer Olympics brought the world's attention and nearly $2 billion in construction spending. Centennial Olympic Park was carved out of a rundown stretch of downtown, and for 17 days in July, Atlanta was the center of the world. But the Olympics also revealed something about Atlanta that the city preferred to keep quiet. In the lead-up to the Games, the city demolished public housing projects and swept homeless encampments to present a cleaner face to the world. The Techwood Homes and Clark Howell Homes, the first federally funded public housing projects in the United States, built in the 1930s, were torn down and replaced with mixed-income developments that housed far fewer people than before. The displaced residents, overwhelmingly black and poor, scattered into the same sprawling metro area that had no transit to serve them. The Olympics were, in a very Atlanta way, simultaneously a triumph of ambition and an act of erasure. Amid all that demolition, one building had been saved, and the story of how it was saved tells you everything about what happened to the buildings that weren't. The Fox Theater, a spectacularly ornate Moorish Egyptian movie palace on Peachtree Street, had opened in 1929 and was designed by the same P. Thornton Marie, whose firm had created Terminal Station. By the early 1970s, it was failing financially and slated for demolition to make way for, of course, a skyscraper. But a grassroots campaign called Save the Fox raised enough money and public pressure to preserve the building, and in 1975, it was rescued. The Fox Theater still stands today, one of the most beloved buildings in Atlanta, but its survival only underscores the obvious question, why this one and not the others? The Kimball House had no Save the Kimball campaign. Terminal Station had no citizens brigade. The Lowe's Grand had preservationist organizing, but then it burned. The Fox was the exception that proved the rule. Saving buildings in Atlanta was possible. The city simply chose not to. Over and over again, corporate headquarters accumulated. Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, UPS, Home Depot, SunTrust. The metro population, which had been around 2 million in 1980, surged past 4 million by 2000 and past 6 million by 2023. Metro Atlanta was adding roughly 70,000 new residents a year. By the Census Bureau's count, it became the third fastest growing metro area in the country, behind only Dallas and Houston. People were arriving from everywhere, other American cities, other countries. 2/3 of the 200,000 people who moved to Metro Atlanta between 2020 and 2024 were from another country. But here is the question that all those growth numbers conceal. Growing into what? Because the growth was almost entirely outward. New suburbs, new exurbs, new subdivisions, new highways. Dawson County, 50 miles north of downtown, became the fastest growing county in the entire United States. Jackson County, farther out still, was the fourth fastest. The sprawl pushed the metro area's footprint across 29 counties covering more than 8,000 square miles, an area larger than the state of New Jersey. Meanwhile, the center held, but only barely, and only with tremendous effort. Downtown Atlanta, for all its glass towers and corporate headquarters, had a persistent hollowness that visitors noticed immediately. There was a deadness at street level, a feeling that the buildings were occupied but the city wasn't. Nowhere was this more visible than the Gulch. The Gulch was a 50-acre void in the absolute center of downtown Atlanta, a sunken expanse of cracked asphalt, dormant rail lines, and surface parking lots sitting directly below street level, wedged between the Georgia World Congress Center and the state capitol. It occupied, roughly, the land where Atlanta's old railroad yards had been, the very ground that the Western and Atlantic Railroad had chosen as its terminus in 1837. For decades, it sat there, empty, while the city grew around it in every direction. You could stand on a bridge over the Gulch and look down at weeds pushing through concrete, at freight trains rumbling through on tracks that had been there since before the Civil War, and at nothing else. Various developers announced grand plans, mixed-use districts, convention expansions, transit hubs. None materialized. The Gulch became an emblem of something that Atlanta's boosters didn't like to talk about. At the city's very core, at the spot where the stake had been driven into the ground, there was nothing. The place where Atlanta started was the place Atlanta could not figure out how to fill. Then, on Friday, May 31st, 2024, a junction of 3 water mains west of downtown Atlanta sprang a massive leak. Within hours, a second main broke on West Peachtree Street in Midtown, at 11th Street. Water gushed through the streets. Hundreds of thousands of residents lost service. The city issued a boil water advisory that would remain in effect for 6 days. The Army Corps of Engineers was called in. Repair crews worked around the clock in confined spaces, trying to patch pipes that turned out to be corroded almost beyond recognition. At an emergency meeting of the Atlanta City Council on June 3rd, the city's chief operating officer, LaChandra Burks, stood before an angry public and said what everyone already knew. We are repairing pipes from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. Our infrastructure is crumbling, and we do know that, and we take no arguments against that. She was not being dramatic. The pipes that had failed were corroded iron mains at junctions where 2 or 3 lines met, creating confined spaces that were nearly impossible to work in. One break had gushed so violently that it blew out the window of a bar on 11th Street. Federal lawmakers wrote to the Army Corps of Engineers requesting emergency assistance, describing the situation in language usually reserved for natural disasters. Catastrophic water main breaks that had left hundreds of thousands of residents, many in underserved communities, without water services. Let that land. The metro area that had added 75,000 new residents that year, one of the fastest growing regions in the United States, was running water through pipes that had been laid when Calvin Coolidge was president. The city that had always been about what's coming next had somehow never gotten around to maintaining what was already there. The growth was real. The skyline was real. The corporate headquarters and the new apartment towers and the world's busiest airport. All real. But underneath all of it, literally underneath, the pipes were from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, rusted through, patched and repatched, running on borrowed time. The water crisis was the most dramatic symptom, but it was not the only one. Atlanta now holds, and has held for more than a decade, the highest level of income inequality of any major American city. The bottom 20% of earners in Atlanta average about $11,000 a year. The top 20% average about $324,000. The Gini coefficient, the standard measure of income distribution, gives Atlanta a score higher than New York, higher than San Francisco, higher than any other city with more than 100,000 people. And the inequality maps almost perfectly onto the city's racial geography. The same neighborhoods that were cut apart by the highways in the 1960s, the same communities that were displaced by urban renewal, are the ones where incomes have barely moved in 50 years. Then there was Buckhead. Buckhead is the wealthy enclave in the northern part of the city, about 24 square miles of mansions, high-end retail, and the kind of manicured lawns that Tom Wolfe once described as rising from the street like big green breasts. It accounts for roughly 40% of Atlanta's property tax base. In 2020, a movement began among Buckhead residents to secede from Atlanta entirely, to de-annex from the city and incorporate as a separate municipality called Buckhead City. The stated reason was crime. The underlying dynamics were more complicated. The effort gained real traction in the state legislature, with bills introduced that would have allowed Buckhead residents, and only Buckhead residents, to vote on leaving. Had it succeeded, it would have stripped Atlanta of nearly half its tax revenue. The secession effort was ultimately defeated in the Georgia Senate in 2023, and its leaders announced a reluctant farewell to supporters in early 2026, blaming the governor for killing the bills behind closed doors. But the fact that it got as far as it did tells you something about the forces pulling at the city from within. The Atlanta Beltline, a 22-mile loop of trails, parks, and transit corridors being built along the path of old railroad rights-of-way that encircle the city, was supposed to be the great unifying project, the thing that knit Atlanta's fractured neighborhoods back together. Ryan Gravel, the Georgia Tech graduate student who first proposed the idea in a 1999 master's thesis, envisioned it as a way to heal exactly the kind of damage that the highways had done. Reconnect severed neighborhoods, create public space, bring transit where the suburbs had refused to let MARTA go, and it has done some of that. The East Side Trail, in particular, has become one of the most popular public spaces in the Southeast. A converted rail corridor where joggers and cyclists and families share a paved path that threads through neighborhoods that had been isolated from each other for decades. But the Beltline has also become one of the most potent engines of gentrification in any American city. As the trail has gone in, property values along its corridor have surged. Longtime residents, many of them black, many of them in neighborhoods that were already struggling, have been priced out. Atlanta is now the 4th fastest gentrifying city in the United States, and some researchers have noted a bitter irony. The city's income inequality numbers have improved slightly in recent years, not because the poorest residents are earning more, but because they've been displaced entirely. And the Gulch? As of late 2025, a $5 billion development called Centennial Yards has finally begun to rise from it. A hotel called the Phoenix, named for the mythical bird, Atlanta's official symbol, opened in December 2025, its ballroom windows overlooking the active freight rail lines that still run through the site. The development promises 50 acres of residential towers, entertainment venues, and retail, with an estimated completion somewhere around 2030 or 2031. The city approved up to $1.9 billion in tax incentives to support it. To fill the void at its own center, Atlanta essentially mortgaged decades of future tax revenue to a Los Angeles-based real estate firm. What are you supposed to make of this? A city that was born from a railroad stake and built itself into the commercial capital of the South. A city that was burned to the ground and chose to treat that destruction not as tragedy, but as opportunity. A city that produced Coca-Cola and Martin Luther King Jr. and CNN and the busiest airport on earth. A city where the bottom 20% earn $11,000 a year and the pipes run through iron laid down a century ago. A city that demolished its grandest hotel for a parking garage, demolished both its railroad stations for a federal office and a parking lot, and let its most famous theater burn under circumstances that nobody ever conclusively explained. A city that sprawled outward so fast it now covers more square miles than New Jersey, while the whole at its center sat empty for decades. A city where the wealthiest neighborhood tried to leave, and the poorest neighborhoods have been leaving involuntarily for years. The 0 milepost is still there, beneath the overpass. The spot where the surveyor drove his stake in 1837. The point from which everything was measured, the place where Atlanta began. Nobody built a monument over it. Nobody built a park or a plaza or a museum. There is no grand marker, no interpretive center, no eternal flame. There's a small disc in the ground near a MARTA station, a few steps from where the Kimball House once stood, a few blocks from where Terminal Station once received travelers with a military band. Above it, the traffic moves. Around it, Centennial Yards is rising, a $5 billion bet that this time, finally, the center will hold. Atlanta's seal bears the image of a phoenix rising from flames. The city chose that symbol after Sherman's fire, and it has clung to it ever since. The idea that destruction is just the prelude to something better, that what comes next will always be grander than what came before. It is a seductive story. It is the story Atlanta has told about itself for 160 years. But a phoenix only works as a metaphor if the burning isn't voluntary. If you're the one striking the match, knocking down the hotel, bulldozing the depot, driving the highway through the neighborhood, letting the pipes corrode while you build the skyline, then you're not rising from ashes. You're just building on a hole. The water came back on after 6 days. The city announced a comprehensive assessment of its pipe system. Officials said the assessment would take a year and a half. Some of the pipes, they noted, might have 75 years of service life remaining. Others might not. There was, at that point, no way to know which was which. Beneath the fastest-growing metro area in the South, under the streets that Hannibal Kimball had improved and Henry Grady had championed and Sherman had burned, the iron was either holding or it wasn't, and the only way to find out was to keep the pressure on and wait.